Welcome to the Word for 2021. Today we're in Exodus chapter 3. Moses is being spoken to by God through a burning bush. As Moses approaches this burning bush, God tells him to take off his sandals, for where he is standing is holy ground. About 30 years ago, I went to a Promise Keepers event. This was one of the very first ones that Promise Keepers held. As I was there in that great gathering, the speaker that day was Dr. Charles Stanley. And what he shared was Exodus chapter 3, verse 5. And what he had shared during that time so impressed me that I can almost still remember word for word exactly what he said during that message. He said, "Take off your shoes." Everyone looked around and said, "Seriously?" He said, "Yes, take off your shoes." He said, when you take a look at your shoes, there's things that you need to understand. God wants us to come into his presence, but we have to come God's way. And so when Moses was about to go into God's presence, he was told to take off his sandals. And then Dr. Stanley said this, when you take a look at your shoe, you understand that it's man-made. Nothing man-made can come into God's presence. We can't come through things that we think are going to allow us to come into God's presence. We have to come God's way. And nothing man-made, nothing of our own making will allow us to come into God's presence. He also said, as you take a look at your shoes, that your shoes give you a confidence and a security. We need to put that aside. When we come into God's presence, we need to be sensitive and tender. That's how we need to come into God's presence. Very sensitive to what he is saying and doing all around us. He said your shoes, you pick out what shoes you want. They are your own personal image. We cannot come into God's presence all about us because it's all about him. So take off your shoes. You need to die to yourself and have your focus totally upon God. It's not what we want, what we think, but what God is saying, and we need to be listening to him. Your shoes, they represent the fact that we are covered. We can be proud. We need to instead come humbly into his presence. We need to come honestly. This is who we really are. Sometimes our shoes, they disguise, they cover what we don't want other people to see. When we come honestly, we're coming just as we are into God's presence. Then he also said, your shoe, you might have had it for a long time. It represents your history. Again, it doesn't matter what happened in the past. God wants to do a brand new thing. So take off your shoes because God's going to speak to you about his future. And then Dr. Stanley said, turn your shoe over. As you take a look at the sole of your shoe, you might find some stones that are there wedged in or things that you stepped in. Again, put all of that aside because God wants to do something brand new. The past is the past, and God wants to do something brand new into the future. So, Moses, take off your shoes, for you are standing on holy ground. You can't come into God's presence your way. You've got to come God's way. God wants us to know that there's only one way to come into his presence, and that is through Jesus. Jesus said in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Do you want to come into God's presence? Take off your shoes. Thank you for joining the Word for 2021.